Weird with the bright lights on me. Hopefully this goes better than the first time I ever spoke at the University of Idaho about 12 years ago. I was speaking in front of a library, and a girl came beelining out of the student union. So if you think of where the stairs are, then you have the roundabout, then you have a walkway, and a girl's beelining it to me. She has kind of like a flowy skirt on, tank top, combat boots, and a shaved head. And I was like, this is going to go well. And as she's approaching me, she just yells out, "You're judgmental." And I said, well, what have I said that's judgmental? You want to take away a woman's right to choose. I said, I haven't talked about taking away anybody's right of doing anything. And so we start going back and forth with little one-liners, which I thought were pretty good. I thought I was being funny. People were laughing. The crowd was growing. Things were going well. And then she ran out of things to say, and she goes, "You know what? You're an ignorant pedophile." And I was like, well, you know what? When you say something like that, I think you're dealing with your own issues out here. Bam, right hooked me. And then she winds up again, and I ran from her. Oh! And as I run from her, she turns around. She starts to walk back through the crowd. I thought I'd be funny. I say, even though you're a feminist, you still hit like a girl. And everyone booed me. And so I will say the booing hurts more than the hit. So don't boo me tonight. I'd prefer you just hit me than boo me. So that's the thing that hurts. What I want to talk about, actually, my original title was Andrew Tate, Feminism, and Daddy Issues, and it got revamped somewhere along the way. And in the editing process, someone revamped it on me. And so the basic idea that I want to drive at is this. Over the last, at least, really since the 90s, I'm 48 years old, there's obviously been discussions about social order, families, family dynamics, and all this sort of stuff. But really over the last 7 or 8 years, I started to see, obviously, a radical shift in the way our culture talks about men, talks about masculinity, and you kind of had the rise of like Red Pill and people like Andrew Tate and even Jordan Peterson. And it's very clear that in one breath, there's a father hunger in our culture. I would say that, people often throw out a term like daddy issues. And I'm kind of glad it was edited out, even though I'm using it, because it can often seem derogatory towards someone. Oh, they have daddy issues. And the reality of it is, if there is the absence of a father, that's a serious issue. It's not a light thing where you sit there and, you mock somebody, your dad left, your dad abandoned, whatever it is. So I started thinking about this more in 2015. There was a weird convergence. Like, you guys are probably like 14, 15 years old when this was going on, but Trump announces his presidency, and then you just have all this convergence of weird people popping out of the woodwork. Milo Yiannopoulos, I don't even know if he's still around, but he's running around talking about feminism being cancer. You had the rise of Jordan Peterson, and this was Jordan Peterson 1.0, so prior to his detox over in Russia, whatever happened, he was kind of really just focused on man issues, just kind of addressing young men on college campuses. And then everybody started attacking him because obviously if you're defending men, you must hate women. And that kind of seemed the basic paradigm that was coming out. So I started to think about this more, and every day I was on a college campus interacting with people. Trump ends up winning, and then you have the giant women's march at the beginning of 2017. They all wore their pink hats, go to Washington, D.C. And throughout that year, there are just a series of things that happened that should obviously be pretty serious issues. You had the rise of Harvey Weinstein and the whole Me Too movement. And the next thing I know on campus, there's all these debates over the future is female and smash the patriarchy. And then people are kind of fighting back. And in general, back then, the Republicans on a college campus were basically reduced to being trolls. Like, their whole thing they were putting forward was, if we control the left, we must be doing something right. And they weren't really putting forth something substantive. They were just kind of ticking people off. So even one time I was preaching at Washington State, and they asked me to show up when they built their wall. I was like, I'm not preaching. I'm not there to support Donald Trump or to preach about his wall. But they thought, I'd add an extra flavor to their dynamics of things. And so all this was taking place, and as I started interacting with more and more students, and this took place actually at the University of Nebraska, I ended up making the comment that well, there are two things, Washington State first, then Nebraska. At Washington State, I was being accused, and this never happens anymore in college campuses, but of violating safe spaces. I'm not making college safe for people. And that was a big thing for about a 2-year period. I don't hear that anymore. But one of the things that kind of stood out when these students were telling me that, it was a certain type of student, and within that, it couldn't help but to wonder, was your life ever safe? Was your home ever safe? That you somehow now need to come out here and make sure that everything is sanitized and all that sort of stuff. Because when I was growing up, I felt like I had a pretty safe home. I could go out in the public, do whatever it was, go back home. I knew mom and dad loved me, wasn't too concerned in and of itself what happened outside of the home. I didn't feel like it needed to be safe for me. And then I was preaching at the University of Nebraska, and I made a comment, kind of offhanded. I was actually seeking to nettle a little bit. And I was kind of surprised at the response. I said, you know what? The more I'm on a college campus, the more I realize how many people come from abused homes. And I was just amazed at how many hands went up at that just kind of assertion. And there might be different definitions of how all that plays out, but however we want to think about it, I think at the very least it's a serious issue. And as I started looking at the issue, I think there is a convergence of two things that has kind of happened. And it's kind of happened over the last few years. I didn't even know who Andrew Tate was till about a year and a half ago. Then suddenly he's everywhere. And I thought he was like the Logan Paul guy. I was like, this guy's kind of a tool. And next thing I know, he's just gaining momentum. Then he's in a Romanian prison. And then this summer, one of the things that stood out that happened, there was a really good article by a woman named Christine Emba, and she writes for the Washington Post. And she wrote an article entitled, "Men Are Lost. Here's a Map Out of the Wilderness." And she goes on to basically explain some of her experiences dealing with college men. And, I can't remember what word she used to basically call you college men. It was basically like you're not wet noodles, but basically like you guys were losers. It was kind of a way that she was kind of getting at, that men won't take initiative, and men won't lead, and men won't do things that she was accustomed, or at least thought at one level, men would do. And so as I read this article and I was reading what she was saying, I was really intrigued by it, because in general, when you get into the masculine and feminine things, in general, you're progressives pro-women. Conservatives have a tendency to be the masculine people. And here's Christine Emba, who seems to be maybe center-left. Nothing about her reeks of a hardcore progressive or a hardcore right-wing women, and she's still trying to get this standpoint of like, look, I'm a straight woman, I want a man. I don't want another woman. I want a guy who's gonna be a man, he's gonna lead, he's gonna articulate a vision for us. That's what I expect from a man, and she's not getting it. And so I thought that was at least interesting, but the thing that was disappointing as I read it more and more is she couldn't actually tell you what masculinity is for. And so she's talking about masculinity, and then she brings in some guy from New York University, and what he's articulating is that basically what it means to be a man, what it means to be a woman, is a socially constructed concept. And so you just kind of have this, this free play of whatever a culture decides a man is, that's what a man is, and whatever a woman decides a woman is, that's what a woman is. But you're sitting there going, well, that's not really what Christine's looking for, and in general, that's not what most women are looking for. Nor, and on the flip side, are men just looking for some abstract woman or just some constructed woman. They're looking for a real woman. So what is a real woman? What is a real man? And I think it's feminism and Andrew Tate. The reason it's now titled Andrew Tate and Feminism, Opposite Sides of the Same Coin, is the root issues, I think, is this. Feminism, I don't believe, can tell you what your masculinity is for. All they can kind of do is try to deconstruct it. So ever since the second wave of feminism, what they basically sought to do was say patriarchy, and then just say it's oppressive, it's a system of oppression, and they want to deconstruct it. So anywhere where men might have a space or anywhere men might have power, we need to destruct that, take it apart, and strip men of basically any aspect of would-be masculinity. But then on the flip side, what you end up having is someone like Andrew Tate, who in another sense kind of comes off as a masculine man. He's a world champion kickboxer. He's obviously pretty articulate, pretty smart. And he's sitting there with, I think, pretty good insight onto human psychology and is willing to step into that space of there's this gap here where there is a father hunger and it's not being filled. Andrew Tate's willing to step into that space and exploit. And so in that sense, I do think that the two of them are kind of operating in a similar paradigm and a similar outlook on the world. And before I get to some more of those details, what I want to basically lay out here is kind of that aspect. 3 quick points I'm just going to assert, and maybe we can develop them in the Q&A. But the first point is that there is a fundamental difference between men and women. I mean, we're not doing high-level math here. But that is kind of almost like a controversial thing. Because I'm not trying to put anybody down in saying this, but we have a culture that now says that I could literally stand here before you and say, well, I identify as a woman, therefore you guys should respect me as a woman. But we all know that there is a binary between the male and female. You cannot produce children with me claiming to be a woman and some dude come along like, all right, let's go have a baby. And so there is a sexed binary here that is an inescapable part of reality. If you want to have a future and you want to propagate the species, you need a man, you need a woman. And that should not be controversial, but when you're in a culture filled with lies, that becomes a controversial thing. So that's the first thing, but intertwined with that, you are your bodies. You're not some soul trapped in your body. So if you don't like your body, you should try to figure out how to like it because you are your body. And intertwined with that is the clear kind of asymmetrical relationship between men and women. And what I mean by that is this. And again, 4 or 5 years ago when you had a women's march, we all knew what a woman was. When abortion used to come up, we would talk about women's rights, and we all knew because women do bear the brunt of the sexual revolution. And so you're sitting there, if you're bearing the brunt of the sexual revolution, you now have a baby and some dude can run off. You're sitting there going, how do I protect myself? If the guy's not going to be there, so abortion's not a debate to be had in a vacuum. It's in the context of a sexual revolution and what's the way forward for men and women. So when they would discuss abortion, I would say it's a pretty meaningful topic for a woman to bring that topic up and expect some sort of answer from the culture because they are the ones bearing the brunt of a pregnancy, and we should recognize that. But one of the things where we basically know where men and women are different is men in general can bench 2.5 times the amount that women can. In their upper bodies, they're twice as strong. I think 2/3 in their legs, they're stronger than women. One of the simple ways we understand this binary is the Dallas under-15 team beat the U.S. women's national team, so the greatest female athletes in the country lost to a bunch of 15-year-old boys. Serena Williams lost to the 205th ranked men's player in the world in straight sets, and she would even tell you it's a radically different game. And none of that is to throw any shade at any women or any men. It's just simply to recognize something that our culture seems to have a tough time recognizing, that in some way, if we're not interchangeable, that somehow the men must be oppressing women or the women aren't getting a fair stick. And that's usually the way it's set because we're assumed to be a patriarchy rather than a matriarchy. But I just want to set out that there's a fundamental binary. So if you want to celebrate diversity, where you should celebrate it is in men and women. There's your diversity, the very place we're trying to eradicate. So what you should do is hold up women in honor and dignity and glory as women, not as, oh, you got to behave like a man and act like a man and do these sorts of things. And similarly, same thing with men. So that gets to the heart of the issue. What does it be a man? What does it be a woman? How does this relate to Andrew Tate and feminism? Oh, one thing regarding the strength of men. Feminist Louise Perry, I believe she's a communist. She writes for The Nation or The Statesman, something like that, over in England, and she says this: in the modern West, it has become increasingly possible to become detached from the sexually dimorphic body when one does not do a manual job, compete in sports, or bear children. But the unwelcome truth will always remain. Whether or not we can bear to look at it, almost all men can kill almost all women with their bare hands, but not vice versa. That matters. And so when I read someone like Louise Perry, I can appreciate it because that matters. When a woman leaves here tonight and it's dark out, her walking across campus is a different experience than the man walking across campus. And that matters. And it should matter to every woman in here, and it should matter to every man in here. Those sorts of things matter, and we're in a culture that wants to say, your biology doesn't matter, or, yeah, there's a biological difference, but we should just have a hard stop. There's a fundamental binary between men and women. And so I was reading some feminist literature going back to the 60s and 70s, and there's a woman particularly who I found interesting. Her name is Kate Millett. Maybe if you're doing some feminist studies, you've probably come across her. But Kate Millett wrote a book called, I think, Sexual Politics. And basically what she put forward was the idea that in order for women to achieve equality with men, you must deconstruct the patriarchy. You must break the traditional family and break these relationships. Because in part, what she thought was basically if a man has authority in the home, he's providing financially, economically for her, she's contingent upon him. So you do have a power differential there, and so he can exploit and all that sort of stuff her. And so that kind of, in some ways, is a kind of a difficult reality if you have an abusive man and all that sort of jazz. And then the other feminist who I was reading, lost a page on my notes. One of the hard parts when I start talking, it's like rip, rip. I just start talking and I'm off to the races. Yeah, so, and then Kate, one of the other things, Kate's sister Mallory relates a story when they're in an apartment in New York City, and what they wanted to do in destroying the patriarchy, because they think basically men were controlling women's sexual behavior. And so they thought one of the ways to destroy the patriarchy is, how can we destroy the patriarchy? By destroying monogamy. How do we destroy monogamy? By promoting promiscuity, eroticism, prostitution, abortion, and homosexuality. That's Mallory's testimony regarding what happened at Kate's apartment. Do you have a question? Oh, okay, okay. I see a hand. I'm like, what's? Okay. And so you have that being put forward. So he's supporting promiscuity, eroticism, prostitution, abortion, and homosexuality. So you got a guy supporting that. And so I think that's fine in a way, and that's the sort of thing that we have to think through. What are the implications of supporting that? Feminist historian Linda Gordon says, the nuclear family must be destroyed, and people must find better ways to live together. Whatever its ultimate meaning, the breakup of families now is an objectively revolutionary process. So that's what some of the feminists were putting forward was we need to deconstruct and destroy the families. And I'm saying if you're a feminist and you think what we need to do is deconstruct and destroy the families and neuter men's sort of strength, what you're really looking to do is create an Andrew Tate. Andrew Tate will gladly step into that vacuum of power. So anybody who's kind of tyrannical in nature is willing to step into a space of power. And so what you end up doing, if you do have this binary between male and female strength, and that even plays out in things psychologically and everything else, and you have a society that says, nope, it's all equal, what's going to happen when you claim that they're all equal is the strong are actually going to dominate the weak. And that might sound offensive, and the goal is not to be offensive. It's that we might find a way that how we can live with one another and love one another, that's a better way forward. And the better way forward is actually real masculinity. So what is masculinity in this context? I came across a good quote from, it was actually from 1938, so you have to go back a little ways to find somebody who's marginally substantive on what masculinity is. And he says this, masculinity implies self-control. That's what masculinity implies. It implies conscientiousness, moral courage, fearless discharge of duty in the face of obloquy, which apparently is disgraced by public abuse, and prejudice. Firm determination to do what is right because it is right and pleasing to God, without regard to human respect, expediency, or popularity. A steadfast adherence to one's religious principles and convictions, and then he says, in a word, an upright Christian character. And I would say that's the sort of thing that you men, you have the next 3-4 years, if you're a freshman going to a senior, you got a couple years, that's the sort of thing that you should be pursuing. And as women, that's the sort of thing that you should be advocating as well in men. People have self-control. And ask yourself, when you consider someone like an Andrew Tate, does he have self-control? I would say the man like that does not have self-control. Does he have moral courage? Depending on what your definition of moral courage is, I don't think he has moral courage. Do I think he has fearless discharge of his duty? I do not. But we also need to consider this. As you consider those things, masculinity is not an end in itself. And I think that's even one of the differences that Andrew Tate kind of taps into. Masculinity is just an end in itself. Whereas a proper view of masculinity is the end of masculinity is towards fatherhood. And so in order to understand what fatherhood is, or to understand what masculinity is, you need some sort of concept of fatherhood, and you be driving towards fatherhood. And that was one of the things that was a little bit frustrating when I was reading the Christine Emba piece in the Washington Post. So here she is talking about masculinity, and she only mentioned fatherhood or fathers 3 times. She says this. Once regarding Jordan Peterson, she says, I have used Jordan Peterson to turn a boy into a man. I used him to turn this guy without a strong father figure into someone who, yes, makes his bed and stands up straight and is now successful. The next one, she says, many of the young men I talked to for this essay told me they had troubled relationships with their fathers or no father figure in their lives at all. The data bear this out. Since 1960, the percentage of boys living apart from their biological fathers has nearly doubled from 17% to 32%. In 2018, Harvard economist Raj Chetty published the groundbreaking study on race and economic opportunity. Among the findings was the persistent income inequality between black and white people was disproportionately driven by poor outcomes among black boys. However, those boys who grew up in neighborhoods where there were more fathers present had significantly higher chances of upward mobility. So when we sit there and we look at, and now he's booing, when we sit there and we look at the economic data, we look at the social data, the reality of a dad present in the life of a young man, in the life of a young woman, it is better not only for that family, but also obviously for society at large. So some 70 to 80% of our men in prison system come from fatherless homes. So there's a huge social cost to having an absentee father. Then you throw in things, drugs, abuse, all that sort of child abuse, all that sort of stuff. It just grows and ramps exponentially, and it becomes a problem. And so what we're seeking to do in laying this out is how can we as men and how can we as women kind of satiate this father hunger? That becomes the issue. And what I want to say is that the issue and the remedy is not actually found in something along the lines of feminism or in Andrew Tate's masculinity. Because as you delve into the life of Andrew Tate, the man is actually a mess. And I think, I can't demonstrate this, but I think the man is a chronic liar. Because every time, he does a good job mirroring himself with whoever he is. So if he's sitting there with a conservative guy, he kind of presents himself as a traditional man and stuff like that. But one of the things that he did is he has this really bizarre tweet about his dad. And it's kind of interesting because I feel like he's very protective in a way. If you've ever watched him talk, he's very protective of his dad. He speaks very highly of his dad. Public testimony is that his dad was a drunk, abandoned them. He'd maybe see them once a year. And he kind of opened up a little bit about that. And he has this bizarre tweet of his dad coming to visit him in New England or in England. And his mom has him go and get a haircut. And his mom says, the haircut's not very good. We should go back to the regular place. And Andrew, being 13 years old, is like, yeah, we should. And then kind of out of the blue, his dad snaps. And he says, Dad stands up from the couch. He says, what the F are you doing? He says, Dad lost his mind. What the F is wrong with you, woman? You're raising my son to be a bitch. Crying about his haircut? This is the kind of man you're raising when I'm not around. Now, obviously, I know nothing of the Tate household, why they're separated, why they're divorced, what is going on. But nothing in his dynamic are you sitting there going, wow, that's real masculinity. That's a man who understands fatherhood, who loves his wife, who loves his children. And even think about this. If you're complaining to a woman, if you accept this binary that Andrew accepts and that I accept, that there is a difference between men and women, one of the most reasonable things is that a woman can't raise a man to be a man. And so Andrew Tate's dad is sitting there with his mother complaining about the way she's raising him when he's not around. Well, what does he want from her? He says that's how females are. Well, if that's how females are in his book, you're going to get what a female's going to give you. And so for him to grumble and complain to his mom with him not being present, the fundamental issue becomes Emery Tate, not Mrs. Tate. Although, again, I don't know all the dynamics of why they're separated. But he goes on to say this. So my dad is a 0 to 100 type of guy, from silence to screaming out of nowhere. Now mom's crying, she tells my dad to get out of the house, and then the dad tells him to come over to the hotel that he's staying at, and he shaves his head. And his dad says this, I sat in a chair holding back tears as my head was shaved. Afterwards, Dad says, your mother loves you, I love you. Nobody in the world cares what your haircut is like. When you grow up, you'll see the only care about what kind of man you are. I went home, Mom went nuts. Then he goes on to tell the tale, but basically, like, if you've seen him, he has a shaved head. A couple years ago when he shaved his head, he recalls that story and he says, and I told them to shave it all off. Nobody gives an F about my hair. They care what kind of man that I am. And what kind of a man is Andrew Tate? One of the things that was pretty funny was, it's one of those things that's like junior high funny. I'm watching this video where he's talking about how you basically groom women, and he called it his PhD course. Anyone know what PhD stands for? Pimpin' Hose Degree. And so that was his course that he's offering up. And I'll just say, if you're a guy who's buying a PhD course from Andrew Tate, like, you're kind of pretty low, you're not an alpha male. You know what I mean? Like, you really are pretty low brow, low level sort of thing. And you're being hoodwinked. Just as he's pimping these hoes over here, he's pimping you too and just taking your money. And he kind of admits that, because what he ends up doing of how he grooms these women is he asks them out, and he is a charismatic guy. Like, you listen to him speak, like I speak publicly, like he'll talk for 2 hours and not stutter. And you got to admit, that's impressive. So he is kind of charismatic, and perhaps he's charming. I don't know if he's good looking or not. But he goes on to say that basically how he'd recruit women for the webcam is he does not mention the webcam early on, because immediately the girl's like, oh no, I'm not a whore, that's gross, that's disgusting, I'm not like that. But then he goes on, what you want to do is you want to go on a few dates with them, and then you want to have sex with them. And now we act like sex is no big deal, but Andrew knows, oh, if I can have sex with them, maybe they're mine at that point. And then he goes on to say that, and what you also want to do is you want to have one of the other bitches basically help groom or recruit her. So kind of like, was it Ghislaine Maxwell, whatever her name was, who helped Epstein. So basically he'd enlist these women to help. And so what he would do, and here's his language, I apologize, it's pretty crass, but he talks about taking them out to dinner. It's martinis, 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 bang, threesome. Slam them both. Your bottom, B-I-T-C-H, knows this girl's like, okay, we'll try, I'll like it. Put both girls on camera together for the first day, give them a bottle of vodka. The guys will send loads of money to get the girls drunk. So here he is, grooming these women, sleeps with them, over time, wears them down, they end up joining up, gives them plenty of alcohol, and then you have a bunch of losers at home on a computer being like, oh yeah, I'm gonna send these girls money. Like, it is amazing that worked, and he claimed that he was making $600,000 a month from this scam. So, when you consider Andrew Tate, what type of man has he become? I'd say not a masculine man. Although for many of you guys, you might think, that dude's kind of a study. Because he kind of presents himself as a James Bond sort of character. He's boasts of having like 10 passports, and he's got all these Bugattis and all this sort of stuff. So he presents himself one way. But at the end of the day, if masculinity is leaning towards fatherhood, what fatherhood builds towards is faithfulness towards a woman and towards your children and raising them up properly, that your boys now learn to respect your mother. Because one of the central things that Andrew's dad should have been teaching him is, here's how you respect your mother. One of the great things I had in my family was my dad taught me how to respect my mother. All my mom had to do if I misbehaved was say, wait till your dad gets home. Oh no, because my dad loved my mother, and if I disrespect my mother, I would feel it, I would know it. And so I needed to learn that as a boy. As we're growing up, you play with your sisters or whatever, and you fight, and you play with them a different way, and as you get older, you talk certain ways to guys, and that becomes inappropriate in the way that you talk to your mother, you talk to your sister, you talk to other women, and so there is a difference between the way that you talk. So what type of man has Andrew Tate become? I would say not much of a man. He's actually become an emasculated man, and he's a man who's a slave to his passions, a slave to his lusts, slave to greed, and he's not a man who has grown to the perfection of fatherhood. And so what is the remedy? What's the way out if you take Christine Emba's language of men are lost and we're in a wilderness? What's the way out of the wilderness? I think the answer is pretty simple in many ways, but it's also extremely difficult. If I can find my note. There's a story that most of you probably at least know the broad concept of it. It's called the story of the prodigal son. And so the question becomes, how are we lost? If the claim is men are lost, and I honestly believe that if a bunch of people are going to Andrew Tate, it's very clear there's a cancer in the bones of men. Why are they going there? Because they're lost. And so what's the way out of the madness? I would say it's this. The story of the prodigal son says that there are two sons, and the younger sons, the younger of them said to his father, Father, give me the share of property that is coming to me. And he divided the property between them. Not many days later, the younger son gathered all that he had and took journey into a far country. And there he squandered his property in reckless living. And when he had spent everything, a severe famine arose in the country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to one of the citizens of that country, who sent him into the fields to feed the swine. And he was longing to be fed with the pods that the swine ate, and no one gave him anything. The swine trough, I would say, in this illustration, or what's going on here, is the swine trough is the ideologies of Andrew Tate, the sexual revolution. Basically, use bitches, get as much money as you can, who cares about them, discard them once they're done. This revolutionary nature of Kate Millett throwing off fidelity and faithfulness and moving towards non-monogamy and just kind of the whole sexual revolution, which ends up leading to pornography, lying, gossip, slander, bitterness, resentment, jealousy, abuse, manipulation. In short, the culture is ideologically lost, I believe. It is also relationally lost. I think if you're honest with yourself, Christine Emba wrote actually a really good book called Rethinking Sex, and she's just talking about how, yeah, we all kind of have this consent thing, perhaps maybe down, but even so many times we consent to sex, but yet it's still miserable on the other side. Why is that? Why is it still miserable, even though I consented? And so you got to give this legal hurdle, but you're not giving a moral idea of what sexuality is. So I believe that we are also relationally lost. Many of us come from divorce homes, and we're sexually lost as well. And so the way forward and getting out of the forest is simply this, because think about it for a second. Can a stray dog be lost? So if men are lost, there's got to be some sort of home. There's got to be some sort of end. There's got to be some sort of goal. There's got to be some sort of purpose. And if all you are is the accidental collocation of atoms that has gotten here over 3.8 billion years of war, death, and famine, and just people having babies, you just kind of had the lucky draw of getting here, you're not lost. You're just one of the stray dogs that just happens to be on the cosmos. And so when we make the claim that men are lost, I think we all know that there's a home that we're missing. And most of you know that there's a home that we're missing. And so the question becomes, what is that home? And my testimony is this, that continuing the story of the prodigal son, he says, but when he came to himself, the prodigal son, he said, how many of my father's hired servants have more than enough bread, but I perish here with hunger? I will rise and go to my father, and I will say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your servant. Treat me as one of your hired servants. And as he arose and came to his father, but while he was still a long way off, the father saw him and felt compassion and ran and embraced him and kissed him. And the son said to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. But the father said to his servants, Bring quickly the best robe and put it on him, and bring a ring and put it on his hand, and shoes on his feet, and bring the fatted calf and kill it, and let us eat and celebrate. For this is my son was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. And they began to celebrate. So the reality of it is, if man is lost, and my testimony is that he is, the question is, what's your home? I would say we're lost fundamentally from our Creator. And until you know who your Creator is, you're going to be confused on what masculinity is. You'll either confuse it with feminism or you're confused with machismo masculinity that Andrew Tate puts forward, opposed to the maturity of fatherhood and faithfulness of what God has called a man to be. Because once you begin to worship God, you realize what his character is, and he is a father, you say, oh, that's what I want to be like. And what is God like? He's faithful. He protects. He provides for his children. So what is needed from you guys? What is needed from you men? And what should you women expect from these guys, expect from these men? That they would go on to maturity, that they would be worshiping and serving the truth, that from there they become faithful men, they become protectors, they become providers. In short, they become what they were made for. And then also, derivatively, it's beyond this talk, but the women would also become more fully what they were made for. And that's the remedy to, and that's the way out of the wilderness that we're currently in. Thank you. Is that the fist guy?
Sure, if that's what you want to call me.
Okay, what's your name?
If that's what you want to call me, sure. My name's Andrew.
Andrew, good to see you.
Yeah, okay. My question to you is, why are you equating men or people in general with animals? You said men are dogs, or you've made people now non-humans. So when you use non-human language to define people, you get to make them into anything you want, not humans anymore, and therefore you get to put any conditions on them, which you just did, which is putting them into a place of chasing some ideal that you have set before someone that you have now dehumanized. How do you respond to that?
Well, I'd say there's two things. First of all, I think when we hurt, harm, use, manipulate, abuse one another, we are dehumanizing ourselves, and so I think there's an appropriate reference. Yeah, well, my reference to the dogs was this: are we stray dogs? So it was just an analogy. Can a stray dog be lost?
So again, this is the problem I'm having is that the fact that you use the analogy and the fact that you're repeating the analogy means that you aren't able to dispose of the analogy and describe this without using the really bizarre analogy.
Yeah, well, I think it's pretty simple. Can men and women be lost?
No.
Okay, if they can't be lost, then I won't pretend to give you an answer on how to be found. I was addressing Christine Emba's point regarding men are lost, building out of what she said, and here's a map out of the wilderness.
She used dogs.
She just said men are lost.
Great.
And I hear women on campus refer to men as dogs, so, you know.
See, you're just conflating something that you've heard with something that was written. So
again, I would just say I have no problem with a simple analogy.
And that's the easy part that you're doing here is you have no problem with simple analogies because it couches whatever you're saying in a way that gives all of these nice people an easy way of digesting whatever trash that you're peddling.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Good question. You too.
Take care. Did you want to hold it? All right, thank you.
I don't think he liked it.
I don't think so. My question to you is, a lot of men in this room, I feel pretty comfortable in my relationship with both my earthly and my heavenly Father. I know a lot of men aren't. Besides your earthly and your heavenly Father, what would be, at least that you know of, just any recommendations of good, real masculine men of the counsel to seek out, to listen to that are not people like Andrew Tate?
Yeah, honestly, I don't listen to much, you know what I mean? I kind of, I have, elders, churchmen that I surround myself with and good friends, and to be honest, most of what I learn about this sort of stuff, I'm watching my friends raise their children, love their wives, be faithful in those sorts of contexts. So I really don't read much. Your best bet, hopefully, assuming you're in a healthy church, is if you have elders in your church, there are requirements for elders in your church, and one of those requirements is essentially that they're faithful to their family and that their children are believers. One of the signs of a healthy dad is that their children are willing to believe what their dad says. Obviously, if dad's a complete maniac, he's like, love God, then he beats the kids, you're like, well, it's reasonable that they would think God's a moral monster because dad's a moral monster. So hopefully, if you're in a healthy church, you should have men there that you can go to and kind of point the way. I realize it's kind of vague, but I don't listen to many podcasts or anything like that. Sorry.
So I just wanted to ask what your thoughts are on men trying to connect with emotions and doing things like therapy or trying to get over things that have happened in their life. Because my dad is an ex-JW.
Okay.
And he spent about 30 years just kind of repressing it. He was like, that's in my past, it's gone, it's done. He was raised in the 80s, so, you know, the only people who have therapy are people who are crazy. That's what he was raised with, and in the last 6 years or so have been when he actually has opened up and spoken to me about that and like kind of processed it through therapy. And I'm wondering, how does that fit with your idea of what masculinity is?
Yeah, I think there's, that's a good question. Like, I'm not really that therapeutic, if that makes sense. There are like, so I think, here's the hard part. I do think people have experienced genuine trauma. You do have to, at some level, address it. Yeah, you know, you could just say he's suppressing his trauma, he forgets it. But I had a pretty healthy, vibrant childhood and things like that. So when I interact with people who I think have experienced serious trauma, one of the hardest things is actually coming to grips with the truth. Jesus, we're familiar with the saying, the truth sets you free. And being willing, and if it's in the context of counseling, I think it's legitimate, going to people you trust and being able to open up about this sort of stuff. Is coming to grips with the reality of what has happened. Because what you realize when trauma has happened to you, how often you're willing to lie about it. And you kind of protect either individuals or you protect other things. And so I think if the counseling, I'll say this, if the counseling is driving towards actually addressing it, so let's just say my parents were awful, I'm not serving anybody well by sitting there and simply confessing their sins. What I want to do is actually address my sin and address the sin. But if it's just kind of, our therapeutic culture where we just want to talk and gossip and slander and cover a bunch of things. But if it's just the aspect of a man that has to address those things, I have friends who are counselors and I've told men to go to counselors. But in general, I understand why a guy would rather just go fishing and talk about it with a friend over a boat or a cigar. Like, I realize that sounds goofy, but I'd rather do it side by side than laying on a couch, if that makes sense. So kind of depends what we're getting at here. And so I wouldn't totally oppose it, but I also don't think it's something every guy needs to do, and that's a real touch of his masculinity, is getting in touch with some light side of him, if that makes sense. But if your dad grew up in a cult, there's a lot of lies to untie, and then oftentimes the fruit of that cult is a lot of manipulation and stuff like that. And so I think getting into the truth of that is important, and being willing to look at it and dissect it, I think, is good.
I was just curious, how did you come to your current interpretation of feminism as kind of like devaluing the women, like entire masculinity and womanity? Because, sorry.
I lost you. Could you mind repeating?
I'm just curious how you've come to see feminism as making men less powerful, instead of kind of how the current interpretation of it is not like that. Instead of just putting all men and women at the equal power, it's just situating them to be in equal positions of power, such as when men and women have an equal political power, but in like situations like firefighters, of course they would have men in that kind of power because of their physical strengths. But I just don't see how you see it as just they're completely obliterating the power splitting.
Yeah, so obviously, yeah, and that was one of the honestly hard parts of like trying to address this topic. If you look at feminism, you have a wide range from liberal feminism, radical feminism, second wave, third wave, postmodern. There's a bunch of things that you can get into in here. And that is kind of why I did camp out at originally kind of 50 years ago. Is it 50 years ago now? 1970, Kate Millett's work. Because whether we know it or not, much of what we're doing right now, and even what you're going through on your college campus, is actually downstream from a lot of what these people were putting forward. And it's kind of the backdrop to a lot of our intellectual thing. And honestly, my position would be this, that just because I think there's a fundamental binary between men and women, we can never come to a place where there's some sort of egalitarian notion of power. And we would never be, even from an epistemological standpoint, we'd just never be able to know it. So I have no romantic vision that men and women can be equal in power. They're simply not. And that doesn't mean anything other than, how do we now navigate that course? And we can try to do that politically and socially, but the only way we can kind of get the two people to be equal in a way is by giving other people power over us to kind of navigate us and kind of neuter us. So that would be the challenge I think that we're having. So what I want to put forward from the standpoint, like Andrew Dworkin says, or she says something to the effect that it's basically feminism is emphasizing humanity of women again and again and again. If that's feminism, then I'm all for it. But the challenge of what feminism did, even going back 100 years ago, was basically females don't have a nature. And that's where we're at right now. Like, there is no woman now. A woman is some sort of internal subjective state that someone experiences. And that's all the fruit of, I would say, second wave feminism that believes that what it means to be a man and what it means to be a woman is socially constructed. So Gerda Lerner, she wrote The Creation of Patriarchy, and she began by saying, I accept the biological differences, but all the values and discrepancies in the social order are because of basically the social order, rather than a derivative of the physicality of men and women. So obviously, feminism is a vast topic, but in general, I would say the idea of deconstructing the patriarchy, and it does kind of put men in scope, and you kind of have to neuter men, and you want them to behave more femininely in some way, not be aggressive, not be this, and that's kind of the way the men are. And so the question is, how do we as a culture take what men are and point it in the right direction, rather than just kind of have a self-willed run riot? Because if we're in an anarcho-capitalist state, women would be oppressed by men if we just let the whole thing just a free-for-all, barring the protection of men. So this idea that we can create a social order where we're somehow all equal, it's not an ideal of mine. I don't value that, nor do I think it's possible. So and that's not to disrespect feminism. I just realize it's complex. I'm talking for 30 minutes, and it's hard to give everybody a fair hearing. So I'm not trying to misrepresent anybody in that process. Do you want to follow up or say anything?
I just kind of have my own view that, well, a lot of people have this view that masculinity is kind of up to the eye of the beholder. There's no definitive definition because it just depends on how people want to perceive it, such as masculinity may just be just everyone's own interpretation of their courage and stuff, and not feeling like, trying to think of the word. They just feel self-confidence, basically. That's what masculinity may be to certain people, instead of just they need the acceptance of others as being a man.
Yeah, and if nobody in here today accepted me as being a man, I'm going to march forward and not flinch. So there's not too much, and that's even kind of the definition of masculinity. My duty towards God and towards my neighbor is so committed that no matter what the public opinion of me is, it's not going to sway me. So I think that's an appropriate place that we want people to pursue. But you still have the question that if it is totally subjective and anybody gets to define it, the Taliban gets their definition of masculinity, Andrew Tate gets his definition of masculinity, then we're kind of in the wasteland of being blown about of, well, what's this toxic masculinity? Well, what if my definition of masculinity is just toxic masculinity and you don't like it? Now we're just at a place of an impasse, and now you're trying to impose some level of moral order on me. Well, not that masculinity. So you're not really comfortable with everybody defining masculinity themselves. As long as it fits a certain tier that you have, we can define it that way. But the minute someone makes it toxic, you would say, well, not that masculinity. So I think that's a challenge, is we all end up defining masculinity and femininity in some way. And the question is, are we getting actually at the heart of, if we have a nature, and I believe men and women have a nature. So the existentialist 100 years ago, I always butcher her name, Simone de Beauvoir, whatever her name is. She was one of the first feminists, and she says, one is not born a woman, you become a woman. And that's not like you mature and go through puberty to become a woman. It's society imposes that category on you, and then you act a certain way. So beginning 100 years ago, they were saying we don't have a nature, and it kind of flows from that existentialism since. So I would just say that men and women have a nature, and the best thing for you to do, if you have a nature, and say you're a plant, getting you in the best soil possible, watering you the best way possible for what your nature is the best thing to do. And I think humans are not plants, nor dogs. I think they're image bearers of God, but we do want to be like people planted by streams of living water that bear fruit in its season. And we must know what a man is, and we must know what a woman is to do that. And obviously, I'm a Christian, and one of Jean-Paul Sartre's ideas was we don't have a nature because there is no God to give us one. If there is a God, then we have a nature. I'm obviously operating from the assumption that there is a God, and each and every one of us has a nature. And what I want for you, what I want for me, what I want for, honestly, for all of my neighbors, is I want you to flourish as who you are, and that does include the reality that you are a bodied being that is a female. And what does that mean for you as a woman to flourish? I want that for you, and I believe the best way for that is us to basically return home, that you and I would live as sons and daughters in our Father's house, with the Father being God. And I think that's the best way for us to flourish.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
So you essentially suggest an individual fix, and there's a lot of power, in individual salvation, redeeming the world. But are there any sort of top-level fixes? And also, is there any things that we can keep from the last, 200 years that maybe we can move forward with and not attempt to control-Z it?
Could you repeat the beginning part? I kind of missed you.
You suggest an individual fix, right? So each of us needs to fix up ourselves, right? Come to God ourselves, and that will redeem the world and kind of fix this mess, right? Mm-hmm. Are there any top-level fixes, such as not coming from the individual, but coming from, government?
Yeah, so I would, I'm all for, I would like to interact with both, you know what I mean? If you guys ask me what my political agenda is, the first thing I'd eradicate all taxes, just kidding. But honestly, and again, this might be I would just say no fault divorce, end no fault divorce. If you enter into a contract with somebody, if I have a right to marriage and then you leave me, you violated something. If I enter into a business contract with you and I violate that business contract, there's consequences for me. The idea that a man or a woman can just leave his family without any sort of consequences, I think, is a horrible thing that does kind of come out of the 70s and that whole wave of the sexual revolution. So there are things like that I do think the state, even when you consider your education, because the one thing the left has right is basically you have this hegemony and you have this background thing that a bunch of people believe and you don't really think about it, you just kind of go forward with it. I would just say that feminism and you think of the average boy. There was a book, Christina Hoff Sommers, who identifies as a feminist, but she wrote a book called The War on Boys, and basically what happens to boys through education. And she was talking about what's the fix? Because all these boys, basically, if you're coming from a single-parent home, you're raised by a mother, you go to school, most of your teachers are women, and you're expected to sit quiet. The boys are being popped up on Ritalin and stuff like that. So I think I would be game to exploring all of those things. I'm limited in my scope of knowledge. But as I read, I'm like, yeah, schools need to be addressed because they're kind of fit at this point, according to Christina Hoff Sommers, and I thought her case was compelling, that they're largely fit towards women, and that's why now even women are accelerating or beyond their male counterparts with PhD programs, master programs, going to college, and all that sort of stuff. So there are plenty of things I would be for. Minimally, the government. I am kind of libertarian-ish because I think the state usually screws things up rather than fixes things. And so anytime we declare war on something, we get more of it. War on drugs, more drugs. War on terror, more terror. It doesn't matter what. War on poverty, more poverty. So anytime the state declares war, go long on it. So anyway, I'd want to do both. But right now in this context, I think the preeminent thing is us as individuals. It is there, and then because then you start to change social orders, and then from there be bold and confront the social order. Don't just take it into your heart and go home and hope for the best. I do think it goes out into the world. So,
thank you.
If you're the age of a college guy and you're away from home at college, depending on whatever you were raised at home, what are some ways that we can, at least today or tomorrow, become from just a guy to a man?
Yeah, one, come up with a plan. Have an idea. So you're nothing of what you can be emotionally, spiritually, financially, spiritually, all those things, you're nothing of what you can be. And you're 18, 19, 20, 21 years old. Don't squander. I realize college is kind of put forth. When I was going off to college, it's way too old of a movie, but there was a movie, Animal House, and I became a Christian entering college. I thought college was going to be like Animal House. So I got to college kind of confused. I was like, you drink, you party, you do whatever you want to do for 4 or 5 years. Then you enter the real world. So it's almost like you go through this realm of chaos, and out on the other side, you're going to become a mature adult human being and all that sort of jazz. So I would say the first thing you want to do, obviously I'm a Christian, I think it begins by submitting to God. Once you submit to God, all right, Lord, what do you require of me? What are the things I should love? What are the things I should desire? What are the things I should delight in? Then from there, fight against the things that your culture gets against. For example, the average 18 to 22-year-old man, you're probably looking at pornography. Stop doing that. Don't waste your life on a screen, especially if you're sending money to somebody at OnlyFans, you're pumping money into that sort of thing. Seriously, that's major loser behavior. And so the best way forward is how can you have self-control? And you want to start having self-control now, and you're going to be tempted with many things. You're away from home, you have access to probably almost whatever you want, drugs, maybe girls, maybe. And so, what are the things you desire? Then from there, kind of have seriously, like one of the things I regret when I was younger is I'm an awful planner. I just kind of fly by the seat of my pants, and it usually works out. I would just plan more. So start, like, if say you're 18 years old, who do you want to be at 23, 24, 25 years old? Take some people that are markers there and be like, okay, and then even sit down and ask them, how did you get there? What do I have to do? And then start implementing those steps and pursue it. But I think it is having good role models ahead of you. If there's a guy in business that you know is successful, go sit down with them. Like, how do I get to where you are? And then if there's Christian men who are godly, like, okay, how do I do A, B, C, F, G? So I do think it really is finding some men that are doing the things you want to do and where you want to go, and simply sitting down and asking them, how do I get there? And then if they're good men, they will say, here's how you get there, and they'll be delighted that some other guys want to try to get there.
Would you please explain what the gospel is?
Yes. So the gospel, the gospel is, in simplistic terms, simply the good news. And the good news is that 2,000 years ago, Jesus of Nazareth was murdered on a cross. He was buried and resurrected. And then he ascended into heaven 40 days later. And right now he has all authority under heaven and earth. And so here we are, literally on the other ends of the earth, and I'm testifying that a Jew was murdered by the Roman Empire, put down. The closest thing we'd have in our culture would be the lynching tree. So imagine 50 years ago, people saying, I boast in nothing but the lynching tree. So a bunch of Jews began to run around and say, we boast in nothing but the cross of Christ. And that's how God is saving the world. And think about that for a second. What is our testimony to you guys? And even when you consider your masculinity and you consider these things, what is God like? Our testimony is that God became a man, suffered at the hands of sinful people, died on a cross, and was resurrected. And Jesus does tell us to take up our cross and follow him. And so the good news is, let's just say you've been Andrew Tate for the first 25 years of your life or 22 years of your life. Is there forgiveness for him? Absolutely. The good news of the gospel is that there is a gospel for the Kate Millets of the world, for the Andrew Tates of the world, and for the me's of the world, that we've rebelled against God. We've not lived up to what God's made our nature to be, to love him supremely and our neighbor equally. And everybody here knows that. Like, I don't care if you're right wing, left wing, everyone's like, love. But if when you go to hand in a paper and you proofread that thing, if you proofread your life, are you really filled with love all the time? And like when you hop online, you're like your anonymous Twitter account, are you really gracious and kind and as loving as you put yourself out to be? The thing that's kind of funny, like obviously I'm a Christian, but there's such a common sense element to it. Like you don't need a preacher to tell you you're broken or the world's broken. The question is, okay, what exactly is broken and what's the fix? We come along and say, our hearts are broken, your heart's broken, my heart's broken, our relationships are broken. That's nothing radical. But the radical aspect of it is that the fix is actually Jesus of Nazareth who died and was resurrected. And that ties in with the story of the prodigal son, that when you return home, I mean, God's not sitting there as a lowering father. He's not there waiting to fly off the handle. He's going to reject you if you return. The story of the prodigal son is he runs out to you. So, people will accuse me if you saw me on campus, always be like, why are you preaching hate? My message from beginning to end is the love of God, that he's the one pursuing us. So the gospel is how God became a man to pursue you, pursue me. He died and was resurrected on the third day, that all of us could be forgiven of sins. And then from there, you are restored to being a real man, a real woman. Or at least the beginning point of that. And the beginning point of that is loving God and loving your neighbor. Then it has bodied existence from there. One last thing. That's one of the things I want to emphasize. Your body matters. I mean, plain and simple. We can often downplay that. We don't think it, and we're in a culture that technology, you can manipulate it and everything else. But your body is a good thing, and God himself became a man. And God himself, in the incarnation, even as a side note for women in this context, as I was prepping for this, Jesus took on human nature. And his death saves men and women, which shows that men and women are of the same nature. So if he would have to become something else. So if women are a lesser or inferior thing, he would have had to become that lesser or inferior thing to save it. But him in his human nature was able to save males and females. So anyway, your body matters. We as Christians look forward to the resurrection of the body. We don't believe in the immortality of the soul and some, my body leaves this and escapes. But rather we look for the resurrection of the body. So like your body, because you're going to have it for a long time. So. Any other? Oh, we got a couple other people.
So you're talking about how a lot of the people that we will talk to are coming from families that are very broken and they don't have the same categories that someone such as myself who has a great father and a great mother, they don't have those same categories. what's the best way to witness to them when their like idea of a father is so kind of corrupted?
So when Jesus called his disciples, and one of the disciples was like, can anything good come from Nazareth? He says, come and see. So the best thing you can do is invite people into your home. Give them meals, feed them, hang out with them, love them. That's the best thing you can do. And then from there, when they see healthiness, they're like, can it really be like that? Is it possible that I can have that as well? And our answer is yes. The difficulty is we're dealing with real people in time and space who sin. But I think that's your best witness. You know, I'm a hoot and holler out on campus. Make of it what you will. But for the overwhelming majority of you, your best bet is invite people into your home, hang out with them, and love them. Jesus says, love your neighbor. So how would you want to be loved if you came from a messed up background? You'd want people to listen to you. You'd want people to spend time with you. You'd want consistency and all that sort of stuff. So that's the best thing I think you can do.
Okay, so how, as a woman, can we encourage men to be more masculine or to be masculine in general?
Man, I should have thought about that more. Because I did have a little line in there about, you women should be expecting this. In some ways, let them. Even if they're roughhousing, doing stupid stuff, especially when they're on the younger side. But even in college, dudes are going to be doing some stupid stuff, and kind of let them. But at the same time, hold them to a level where they a moral dignity towards you. I would say hold them to that expectation. Don't cave on cultural expectations of, oh, well, no big deal. But I would say one of the primary things you can do is expect of them to hold you up with honor and dignity and glory. And when they do that, in general, they're going to do one of two things: either immediately leave, or they'll begin to step to the occasion and hang out with the people that want to step to the occasion and be suspicious of the people that want to leave. So I would say that's your best bet is have a clear moral vision in your head of how they should be interacting with you. And that's a little bit subjective. But then, expect that from them. And without being a dripping faucet, it's fine for you to articulate clarity of what you're expecting. You know what I mean? It's not like, oh, they're a guy, I can't do it. Tell them, let them know. So I would say that's even part of it, is providing clarity and those sorts of things.
All right, well, we're out of time. Let's give one last round of applause to Keith Darrell.